three, four. Welcome to Off Panel, Sketch.com's weekly podcast. This week, our guest is the designer of Drifter, Wolf, Zero, and plenty of other books. It's Tom Muller. Thanks for coming on the show, Tom.
Hey, David.
You've been increasingly busy over the last few years. You've been designing comics for varying publishers and with numerous creators, but that's only part of your world. You're also an associate creative director at digital agency Code and Theory, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So one thing I wanted to lead with is what's your background in design and how did you transition into working in comics as well?
Well, I kind of like my background in design is, let me see. Well, both my parents were interior designers,
Oh,
and I kind of grew up in a family of like lots of like design oriented work that my dad parents were interior designers. Then my uncle is an architect. My cousin is a sculptor. My brother works in 3D imaging. So there's always been that kind of like design creative flow running through the family. I mean, if I go back even further, my grandparents were like they were active in painting.
mm-hmm.
They were also architects. So it was kind of like almost a done thing for me to just follow in doing something creative. So I went to high school that was really focused on creative arts, visual arts, and then after that I moved to um, I think they've renamed it a few times, but it's still the Royal Academy for Fine Arts in Antwerp,
Mm-hmm.
where I studied graphic design for 4 years. Then upon graduation, like didn't really know what to do, where to go, because I was like always thinking of maybe doing something with comics, but that was like being in Belgium, I didn't really see how I get my foot in the door, because
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't really an artist. I was always more design focused, and then I ended up in digital design. So I worked for a few years in Belgium, then moved to London. And I've always worked at digital design studios,
Mm-hmm.
and then I think in 2000, I think it must have been 2000 or 2001. I kind of had enough digital like knowledge, like I was able to do like build design and build my own websites,
Mm-hmm.
and I was maintaining the website for my local comic book shop back in
Oh,
Antwerp.
nice.
And that was like I was like, oh, I can combine comics and digital, and I can so I was kind of like still even after I moved to London, I was still kind of keeping that site up to date and using that as a kind of like a space for me to experiment, like learn new things, that kind of stuff. And back in the day, that was like 99, 2000, 2001. It was really it was kind of a done thing to have a links section on your website,
Mm-hmm.
linking to like related sites, stuff that was cool. And I had like this whole list of comic book artist websites that I found, and one of them was Ashley Wood's website.
Mm.
So I really liked his site, and I had this little feature on the comic book shop site. I was like, this is the featured site of the week. And I emailed Ashley and I was like, oh, hey, dude, I love your work. I made your site the featured thing on, kind of like this local comic book shop website. But he got back to me and then we started talking, and he asked me if I was interested in redoing his website because he's seen my
Oh.
work. So um, obviously I said yes, because it was a weird period for me, because back then I had already like was living in London for a year, and after that year the whole dot-com bubble basically burst, and I was made redundant because the offices, like studios, were closing down left, right, and center.
Mm-hmm.
And that website was a really good thing for me because I had like a nice portfolio piece. So I did his website, and we kind of stayed in touch. And then one website became a second website, and I kept doing his sites. And then I started like kind of doing logos for him and did some logos for his pop-up books.
Hmm.
And then we kind of like we just kept working on and off together on like, little things, little side projects. And that was kind of, I guess, my way into like, comic books and starting out in digital. Then on the back of that, I did the website. That must have been like almost 12 years ago. Did the website for Kent Williams, who was buddies with Ash, and then I kind of realized that the whole scene, the whole comic scene is quite tightly knit, and like everyone knows everyone. Everyone's
Hmm.
always checking out each other's work. So from working with Ash, I did kind of a little thing for Kent Williams, and then I was always hanging out on comic message boards. I was on Liam Sharp's forum back then. I was on Mark Millar's forum, where incidentally quite a few writers and artists were hanging out as well. And I think was it 2004, 2006? Um, don't know if you can hear, but they're shooting fireworks outside.
I was
There's
wondering what
like
that
some background
was.
noise. It's like there's no shootings going on. It's fireworks.
That's good.
Um, but I think it was it 2004, 2005 that Warren Ellis was running the engine
Oh, it was somewhere around
message
there.
board, and I somehow managed to weasel my way into that board because it was quite closed off. It was kind of this place where a lot of people that were kind of working in comics were hanging out and just like talking shop and
Hmm.
finding people to collaborate with. And at that stage, I had coming out of Ashley's work and hanging out on um, Mark Millar's board. I started working with Liam Sharp, and then we did. I got involved with his Mamtor publishing outfit and did the design and art direction for the Event Horizon anthologies, a
Mm.
couple of books, and then via the engine, I met Rance Hosley, who I worked with on the Tori Amos comic book tattoo graphic novel,
Hmm.
and I met
Brandon.
Ivan Brandon,
Hmm.
and I did the second of his 24/7 anthology books, and out of that came Viking. And then, Ivan introduced me to some people at DC, so I just started doing some logos for DC Comics. So that's kind of like I used to do a lot of kind of one-off things, or like I'll do like one graphic novel here, a limited series dress there, and it wasn't really until I started working with Alice on Zero
Hmm.
that I started to do like monthly books, and that kind of really, I think, the last 2 years, 2.5 years, my comic book output has really drastically increased just because I'm doing monthly work. So it's like my stuff is much more visible now because
Hmm.
there's not like a gap of months on end between like a cover or like 4 issues of this, 2 issues of that. So yeah, that's kind of a protracted path into comics. But at the same time, I'm always, as you said, my day job is graphic design, digital design. So I've always worked at agencies. The last 5 years, 4 or 5 years, I've been self-employed, run my own studio, and then since September, I've stepped back into like agency life full time
Hmm.
with my role at Code and Theory.
Well, it sounds you're a fairly busy guy, just a little bit.
Yeah, you could say that.
Well, so you're doing as far as monthly work, the stuff you're doing with LS, you're doing Drifter, but what
Yeah,
other are you doing any other monthly work? Because I know you did logo design for several Vertigo books,
yeah,
and I know that you've done a lot for Valiant as far as kind of redefining their look, like with things like Divinity and other books like that.
yeah,
Are
yeah,
you
yeah.
doing any other monthly work right now?
So let me see. The monthlies I'm working on. So we still have Wolf with Alish.
Right.
Um, Material, just we just canceled Material.
Hmm.
Otherwise, that would have been running monthly as well. So there's Wolf, there's Drifter, The Violent with Ed Brisson
Oh,
and
right.
Adam Gorham that got announced. I think last month.
Hmm.
I think that the series is coming out in January. There's another monthly that's going to be announced when the previews listings for February drop.
Hmm.
Um, what else? I'm doing covers for the next series of Divinity, which I'm working on now.
Hmm.
Um, so let me see. I have to check my computer. There's another series that's unannounced as of yet, and we haven't gotten a launch date yet, but
Mm.
that's potentially another one. So let me see. One, two, three, possibly four ongoings at the moment, and then occasional work for Vertigo or DC, and
Hmm.
then for Valiant, that kind of I'm not really for Valiant. I'm not specifically locked into like monthlies
Hmm.
as like kind of like a full-time gig, but I'll do like a trade dress or like variant cover art for like a couple of miniseries or storylines.
Hmm. So one thing I'm curious about though is and uh for like the monthlies, for example, like
Yeah.
what is how does your role play out? Are you involved like because all the stuff you're doing for the well most of the stuff you're doing actually I guess all the stuff you're doing this monthly is creator owned. Like how
Yeah.
involved are you from the start and how does your role progress as the series goes into straight up monthly mode?
I've been really lucky that with all the creator-owned books that I'm working on, I've been able to be really involved, like pretty much from like months before we even
Hmm.
start announcing books. Um, you know, Going back and forth with the creative team, and that involves pretty much everyone. So it's like writers, artists, if there's editors as well, color artists, the letterers as well. So I'm kind of like talking back and forth, um, you know, months before we start, even before there's even a book, um, to kind of like define what the book will be, what the
Hmm.
book will look like. We all kind of act as mutual soundboards to just bounce ideas off of each other.
Hmm.
Um, and then when the books go into monthly mode, like especially with say Zero or Drifter, I'm always like I'm pretty much in the loop all the time. Like
Hmm.
I'll get to see art, and I get a lot of room to kind of like inject my my take on the book, so I can kind of steer how the covers will look, steer what the design will be, that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
Well, yeah, so it's kind of like it's a very open and mutually creative process where I'm always, I'm really involved with everyone else.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's really I really like for example like on Drifter and on Zero on how you both you work with artists but you
Yeah,
also add your own spin to it. So like Drifter you have kind of like the I don't even know how to describe it like I don't want to say dots because I feel like that's incorrect but like like the
no, they are dots.
yeah, the dots that you're putting onto the cover that's integrating on both the the standard cover and the variant covers, and then
Yeah,
Zero. Like I don't know, I thought Zero's covers were so fascinating throughout, and that the trade dress was so incredible, and it's really cool seeing the design integrated so holistically into like the covers because like there's really I mean as far as mainstream like monthly comics, the only
mm,
books I can really think of that are similar are I guess like Nowhere Men with
yeah,
photographics, like Stephen Finch really incorporates
oh yeah,
really well. I love what he does into that, and then like his work in general has that. But I guess for me, one of the questions I have is like you've worked on books where you're like more or less the sole cover creator, while others you work with artists to develop the
yeah.
cover. How much does interacting with another artist impact your approach to design for a book?
Well, the thing is, I try to like approach the design of a comic as I don't really want to think of it as I have to do like quote unquote comic style design,
Right.
or kind of like make something that somehow fits or adheres to what you might expect a traditional comic book would look like.
Right.
And I like to, because I kind of work outside of comics most of the time,
Hmm.
and like I'm really embedded in like in like graphic design scene, digital design scene. So I try to like grab those things and push them into comics. So when I'm if I'm doing some editorial work or I'm doing some publishing work outside of comics, it's kind of like the job of a designer to take like all these various elements, to like choose type, choose imagery, design a theme, a visual theme for a book cover, a magazine cover,
Hmm.
whatever, and bring all those elements together into like a cohesive form, like a one strong piece that really sells the proposition of the series. So that's what I tried to do with, when we were working on Zero. It was really cool to have like a different artist for every issue, and
Hmm.
Alish kind of told like the artists for every issue that this is how we're working, this is how we're doing the covers for the comics. So I'd get a piece of black and white art
Hmm.
from whoever was doing the issue that month, and then I'd do like I'd work that in. Alice would, he'd tell me, he'd give me either it would be just a one sentence description of this is the theme of the book, or
Hmm.
I'd get like the full script, and I'd use those things. And obviously, there's recurring elements, like the font of the logo is the same, but it can be treated differently every issue. The core typeface for like the credits and everything else is the same. So with those like returning um, locked elements, I kind of play around and I do the coloring and treat the logo differently for each issue, kind of integrating art and design as one thing. So it's never like, okay, here's my art. I'll just slap the logo and whatever on it and
Hmm.
move along. That's it. I think with Drifter is the same thing. Like Ivan, Nick, and I spent a lot of time before we even, before there was even like a full first issue or anything, when it was just like some mood pieces that Nick had painted,
Hmm.
how we're gonna treat the cover and how the series would look like. So that's where I came up with, and this was, I think, spent at least a month or two just trying out things and trying to find a look. Obviously, Ivan and Nick have an idea of where they want to go with the series and what
Hmm.
they kind of want the thing to look like. So that's where I come in and try to like kind of visualize those ideas, while at the same time kind of approaching it with how I would see and what my take on it would be. So that's how I came up with this really tight square grid where I can constantly move things around, like had the dot pattern as well.
Hmm.
So it's a really flexible thing how I can, like, month on month, keep the same look but constantly change it. And so if you look at the covers I've done for um, the first volume versus the covers I've done for the second volume, I've kind of like, the first volume was all about the lines and the grids and the dots, and then the second volume is more of like flat colors, blocks of color, but it's still the same system. And, you kind of like move on with that.
Hmm.
So yeah, even though we kind of like design and decide on, say, a look or a theme at the start of the series, there's always room to keep kind of like massaging it, like improving it, slightly tweaking it, versus where like Zero was changing month on month on month, and the thing with Drifter is change it but keep it uniform.
Hmm. Like very within a I don't know, foundation that you guys have already created, more or less.
Yeah, it's kind of like I think you can call it like the brand identity of the book
Hmm.
is Nick's art mixed with my design, and I'm really lucky that Nick and Ivan are really, really open to my input. And if I would like cover half of Nick's art, for example, and it somehow turns out to be a strong cover, then they'll be happy to run with it because it makes a good cover, and they're not like super precious about their part, and vice versa as well. I think it's important to find that middle ground where I equally back off or like tone down the design if the art needs to really speak.
Hmm. One of the things, like Drifter, is one of my favorite books, and one of the things I really love about it is like, you read a lot of comics, and no offense to other comics, but you read it and it's like a 10-minute experience or 15-minute experience, and you're just kind of, you're through. You don't really like it's a read, but you don't really get involved with it. And with Drifter, like the
Yeah,
way with the design and with Nick's art and with Ivan's writing and everything about the book, it has a really like cover to cover immersive feel that very
yeah.
few books have. And I guess so. Like when you're talking about like developing the design for Drifter, like how much time did like you and Nick and like Ivan put together? Like, did you guys spend time putting together like influences and like visual touchstones for the project or anything like that? To like,
Oh yeah, I think we had like, especially early on, we had these discussions like, this is the book, this is kind of like the vibe that they're going for, and there were references, and like, this is what we like, this is what we kind of want to do with our book.
hmm
We don't want it to look like a comic per se. We want to, Ivan, I mean, ever since I worked with Ivan and Nick on Viking, um they're like, the both of them are really open to like, they want to inject like some kind of like modernity into the books that they're doing, and do something that's really unique and that kind of stands out from everything else. So yeah, there were like obvious references from book covers, film posters, DVD packaging, all
hmm
that kind of stuff. Like sometimes like stuff that doesn't have anything to do with comics or publishing. It can be like a nice piece of packaging
hmm
design, for example. And I think that's really important. Like as a whole, that you can kind of like pull these references from outside of comics and kind of like genre fiction,
hmm
and kind of like push that back into comics and do something different with it. So yeah, there were definitely like, I think with everything else, with Alish as well, I think Alish is also really good in like, coming up with references that aren't necessarily like bound to like, genre publishing. And it's really interesting for me to kind of work with um creators like that kind of like think outside of the medium and
hmm
try to pull these external influences back into it, and kind of like, that keeps everything fresh and do something new with it.
Yeah. Well, it seems like inspiration can really come from any place, and I think it's awesome that
Exactly.
I think it's awesome that like it can come from packaging. But so one thing I have to ask, just because I think you probably do, but I know you use Pinterest.
Yes.
Do you use it at all to like kind of like vision board out projects or anything?
No, I've been using Found. Not sure if you remember that.
Don't.
It was started by a Japanese interaction designer called, oh, I might mess this up, but I think it's Yugo Nakamura. And he started Found, and it was kind of like, it's basically the same as Pinterest,
Wait,
but
is
it's
it like
not.
found?
Yes, is that one?
Okay, yeah. My wife is an architect, and she loves that.
Yeah. So I use Found for. I don't use it as a reference board per se. I use it. I mean, it kind of becomes a sort of visual reference, but
Hmm
I just use it to collect like things I find cool, and
hmm
I might find like, someone has uploaded like a Lego space catalog from 1979, and then I'll just add all those things to my Found.
That's awesome.
But it's not necessarily. I don't always. use services like that to build like a reference for myself. I
Hmm.
kind of I as much as I try to, I want to avoid looking too much at
Other
other
things.
stuff.
Yeah.
Or if I would use references, I want to look at stuff that's at least like 20, 30, 40 years old,
Hmm.
and look at those things, because you see work from that era and you can easily see what has kind of stood the test of time, what still looks fresh and modern.
Right.
And it's kind of like, it's that what I want to, if there's any reference that I want to use, it's that kind of, find that perfect element that you can design something where, in 5 years time it's still gonna look fairly fresh,
Right.
even though comics are like a very disposable medium, and things get lost quite easily in the noise and get replaced quite easily by just by the rhythm and the frequency of publishing.
Hmm.
But it's still this kind of like this thing that I like to achieve, is design something that's current,
Timeless.
but yeah, timeless.
Yeah. Well, no, it's funny because I have a friend who he absolutely despises. I'm not saying that I have an opinion on this, but he really doesn't like it when comics make specific pop culture references because he feels like
Yeah,
when you reread it later, it's going to feel really dated because it has like a reference to the Spice Girls or something like that.
yeah.
And I like that you kind of go for a more timeless look because um, I don't know. I mean, one thing that keeps standing out from things that you're saying is like you kind of have to push against the comic form to do what you're doing. Would you say that's a fair statement?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I try to. It's this thing. Like, I love looking at, like, you know the visual language of comics, like
Sure.
through the decades, and really look at the evolution and the craft of designing logos. And I think Todd Klein has, I think his blog is amazing, like how he can spend like you know weeks on end, like do like 10 posts on the history of, say, like the Superman logo.
Hmm.
And he goes through and like he posts like archive material and whatever, like he digs through things. And I think that's really interesting to see how that language evolves, and how like just the craftsmanship of hand drawn typefaces, and
Hmm.
like that custom feel. Yeah, that's the thing. This one of the things I kind of keep harping on about, like every time someone allows me to speak about it, is that I, it's, yeah, it's one of these things. It's like, it grinds my gears. Yeah, it's one of these things where coming like being I mean, speaking for myself, like being surrounded by design like every single day. And I kind of I can kind of see, like, the difference between what's happening in like, say, comic book publishing, and what's happening in design, in publishing as a whole. And like independent publishing, like you see all these like little niche magazines being published. You see, stuff that Wired magazine, for example, is doing month on month. And I'm trying to kind of like, I don't see why you wouldn't be able to do something like that in comics, and that
Hmm.
why comic books have to kind of keep using the same visual vernacular month after month, year after year after year. Like, your trade dress goes in the top left corner. You can only use the top one third of a cover for logo placement, that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
And logos have to have like outlines, gradients, bevels, like all that kind of Photoshop gunk that was introduced once, like in the 90s, when all of a sudden people went like, "Oh, we've got Photoshop now. We can do all these neat effects." And I
Hmm.
think it was cool for a while in the 90s, when people were actually, because it was new, and there was this kind of like experimentation with it, and see like how you could, like, use this new technology to make covers look cooler. But I think there's like in parts of the comic book industry, there's this thing of like, no, this is what a comic should look like, and we
Hmm.
need to do these logos, and we need to do these covers like this. And wherever I can, which is luckily I'm working with people in creator owned publishing where I can kind of like push that stuff. And then weirdly enough, it was it was doing the zero covers and Drifter that got me that brought me to the attention of Valiant. And then they asked me if I was interested in doing the Divinity covers, kind of doing the stuff that I was doing for, say, Zero.
Hmm.
That kind of like abstract coloring, doing anything like not making it look like quote unquote a traditional comic book. And
Right.
I think that's really cool, especially for like, someone like Valiant is seen as, they do superhero comics predominantly.
Hmm.
So for them to kind of take that leap and say like, we're going to try something different, and it then kind of paying off for them as well. I think that was for me, I thought that was a really like bright point. But then at the same time, working with the design team and the editorial team at DC and Vertigo are also really really clever in what they're doing. And if you look at like, the new series that Vertigo is just launching like this autumn, like
Hmm.
they've been really like, working hard to like make these books like look as cool as they can and like really play up the design and the logos.
Hmm. Going back to Valiant really quick, one thing I got to say
Yeah.
about them is they kind of, in general, feel like they're a little bit more willing to experiment than other publishers, and I think it's partially because
Mm.
they're simultaneously young and old in a weird way.
Yeah, I know what you mean. But I think, yeah, I mean, it's like the current the guys that are running Valiant now, like, when they relaunched, they got Ryan Hughes to do like their
Right.
whole trade dress and their whole branding, and it's like such a strong look.
Hmm.
And I think it's really cool to see like a publisher do something like that and really go for such a strong unified, like really graphic, kind of like publishing design.
Hmm. One thing that I think I kind of harp on this all the time is in comics, I kind of feel like for the most part the comics as a whole kind of looks at comics as one thing. It's like, it's a 20-page comic that comes out every month and it looks like this and this is what it is.
Yeah.
And like it doesn't seem like there's a
Mhm.
lot of variation, even though it seems like there's a lot of evidence that things could be done in a different way and find success. And whether that means
Yeah.
the design or trade dress or like the format of comics themselves. I mean, you look at like a comic like Island Magazine that Brandon Graham and Emma Rios are putting together, and
Yeah.
that's not really a trade and it's not really a
Oh yeah.
comic. And anyway, so I sometimes wonder if like the kind of things that you're talking about, like trying to push comics in like a different direction as far as design is concerned, is related to kind of a general fear of newness because of how reliant comics are on like having like the one audience that's been with them for forever.
Yeah, I totally get what you mean by that, because it is, if I do sense that there's, and I think publishers sense that as well, that
Hmm.
there's like, there a lot of them, or like, all the people that I've been lucky enough to work with, you kind of there's always this kind of, we want to push something, but there's always that thing, especially if you go to like the bigger publishers and like, Marvel, DC, that have like huge histories and like a really entrenched audience, and kind of like decades of history, like both as publishers, but also like storylines and all that stuff.
Hmm.
So I think it's really hard. It's like, it's like an oil tanker. You have to start turning like really 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 long before you actually want to make the turn.
Yeah.
And I think, like publishers like Valiant, are a lot more nimble, and they can just say almost like from week 1 to week 2, all right, we're going to do this, we're going to change it all up, and we're going to run with it. Image is image. There is no real overarching look and feel, or kind of a rule book of how they want to have the comics look like they do.
Hmm.
So you see like what Brandon has been doing with Islands, like what he was doing, like even with Prophet, like
Hmm.
just story wise and like art wise. The stuff that Stephen Finch has been doing with Nowhere Man, like They're Not Like Us, like what he's doing with Warren and Declan now. It's all these things, like that's like kind of like I see a lot of really cool stuff happening at Image, where like I think maybe it's just um that time where
Hmm.
like we're in this kind of like scene where a lot of people coming into comics, or a lot of people like working in comics and now kind of like starting to push things, that you see that kind of more, I'd say, design savvy approach being adopted more widely. I mean, like the stuff that Jarrett has been doing on Paper Girls,
Hmm.
what he's doing on Southern Bastards with both Jason Latour and Jason Aaron. It's all that kind of like you see closer gelling between art and design, and I think that's a really important kind of move that's being like kind of like being pushed through comics at the moment.
Hmm. No, I completely agree with that. I love that oil tanker analogy. I think that's perfect. And I do think it's interesting. It's kind of like the oil tankers are like surrounded by jet boats, and the jet boats are kind of like creator owned, and like they're able to kind of go in
Yeah,
every different direction. And they're like you said, like with Valiant, like there's a nimbleness there that they just can't do because of the nature. They're
yeah,
like owned by Disney and Warner and things like that. And I do think it's interesting to see kind of how I would say this kind of move towards design being a bigger factor in comics really has been over
yeah,
like the last maybe like 5 years or so. I feel like Jonathan Hickman was a huge part
yeah, definitely.
of that being kind of incorporated more. But I do like seeing creator owned and seeing how like you were saying with Cliff and Jared on Paper Girls, like
Yeah,
the integration of art and design into a more holistic look for a book. And I know that's one of the main things you're looking to do on your books, right? Is like you're trying to find
yeah,
the best way to achieve a holistic look for like a unified look for a book, right?
yeah, exactly. I don't see. I think I have to remember because I brought this up in a talk I gave last year,
Hmm.
and it was about, yeah, it was basically creating a really like individual brand look for a series,
Hmm.
so that whichever issue it is, wherever you see it, you always know it's that series, but it's a new issue. And I think I said, like, for sake of my own argument, I compared what I was trying to do with Zero, which is like, it's there is a kind of unified theme. The unified theme was there is no theme, but you can still kind of recognize the cover of Zero when you see it, and you can kind of see that it's completely different from what came out last month. So it's clear that it's a different issue.
Hmm.
Whereas if someone who has read no comics whatsoever walks into a comic book shop and sees 20 X-Men issues lined up, they won't be able to know where to start, or
Right.
which issue is new, which issue came out 2 months ago, because there's like it always looks the same. The art has the same look and feel. The logo is always placed the same way. So there's that kind of uniformity, what you see in a lot of superhero books, that if you're not really into comics, you get lost really easily.
Yeah.
And I think if, like, if you use design as kind of as a tool to really set apart your own book, and then b use it to make sure that every issue looks different, so that's clear, that
Hmm.
that there's like there's a sequence.
Yeah. No, I think that is definitely important, and I think that so I talked to Cliff Chang on my podcast a couple weeks
Yeah,
ago, and actually I guess did it go? No, it was 2 weeks ago. Anyways, and he like we were talking about covers and
yeah,
like the covers that they were doing for Paper Girls, and like how
yeah,
he somehow made like his life easier than it's ever been with the covers for Paper Girls, but we were talking about how they stand out more than anything else just because they're using the solid colors that they're using.
Yeah,
And and
exactly.
and I think that's really fascinating because it's like I don't when you look at the comic stand and like you look at all the comics that are out in a week and you see Paper Girls, it stands out so much because like even a
Yeah.
simple idea is like solid colors that aren't like white stands out.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't know. I just think that's interesting how like it seems like there's a lot more tinkering with the form to not just covers but also like the interiors and everything. Like, do you read?
Yeah.
Have you read Trees by Warren Ellis and Jason Aaron?
Yes.
Like, I love the opening,
Yeah.
the inside cover to the first page transitions that Stephen Finch does.
Yes. How it immediately, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that it immediately leads you into the book, and you kind of get it has a very filmic quality. I think
Absolutely.
that's a genius thing to do. And the same, I think, what Steven's doing on They're Not Like Us, where you just have like all the credits on the front cover and get it out of the way.
Hmm. And I also love how there's like the very first panel of the story is on the front page too, on the
Exactly. Yeah.
cover. Like
Yeah.
it's interesting because I'm trying to remember who it was. I think it was Charlie Chu from Oni Press. He had tweeted something about
Yeah.
like what it like what people want out of like their first pages or like the inside front covers and stuff like that, as far as like some people want like previously on and some people
Yeah.
want like I don't know other things. And I really like what Steven's doing.
Yeah.
I really like in the fade out. I don't know if you've read that, but Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips, how they have like a kind of cast of characters that fits both, like as a
Yeah.
it fits as a reminder of who's who in the book, but it's also great because it fits the film like background of the book itself.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's really interesting seeing how these books are. I don't know. I mean, like, I just find it really fascinating, and maybe you can share some insight into it. But like, why do you think it is that all these things kind of seem to be happening over the last few years, really? Or do you feel like it's not? Or do you feel like it's been happening for longer than that?
No, I think I definitely get that same sense that there's like this upward momentum where all of a sudden there's like all these different creative teams kind of doing a similar thing where they're kind of like putting you like using design a lot more to tell their stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's kind of coincidence that it just happens to happen all at the same time or like within a very short space of each other.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that kind of gives you the feeling that there's something new happening, but it's still like, it's kind of still happening in, say, like one corner of comics.
True.
And it'll take, I think, if these things tend to be successful, it'll take a while before these things get adopted like industry wide.
Mm-hmm. And I do think that probably the most natural parallel is the fact that it's mirrored the rise of creator owned as a much bigger thing.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. But one thing I really am curious about, and I know that's not exactly it's apples to apples ish, but when
Hmm.
you're working on a book like let's say like Divinity, for Valiant,
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
dramatically different is that experience than working on a book like Drifter?
I think, well, I think there's a lot more. I think that's, even though with Drifter. Well, yeah, it's a good question. I think that the biggest difference is that working for Valiant or say DC, it's a lot more editorially led.
Mm-hmm.
So there will be there's a much more formal process of reviewing
Sure.
what I submit, be it a logo or a cover piece of cover art. But so far with Valiant, it's been like an incredible relationship. I mean, I don't have to go through like hundreds of revisions, and because it's coming from like doing a analogy like when I'm working in design, and like, from working on digital projects, there's like rounds and rounds and rounds of, like, things being iterated, being changed, and what you start with might not necessarily be the thing that you end up with.
Yeah.
But I think with, when doing like designing for comics that are predominantly led by editorial teams, so far it's been like a very fluid process of me submitting a logo design or a cover piece. There might be some tweaks, but and that's it really. I mean, when I did the covers for the first volume of Divinity, those were pretty much greenlit with like the minutest of changes I needed to do.
Oh, that's excellent. Well, I think it's funny. I did this poll, like a survey of or comic artists, like pretty much like the very first thing I did on Sketched, and
Yeah.
the publisher who made people the most happy, or like that had the strongest reviews, so to speak, in comic Yelp, um,
Yeah.
it was Valiant, and like it seems like they're actually like they seem to treat people creatives fairly well and give them a lot of leeway to do things. Not
Yeah.
saying that they've never like they're angels or anything like that, but it is good to hear that like they are receptive to outside the box thinking. And like your advertising agency experiences are so. Oh, like I told you before we started the call, I work for an advertising agency, and
Yeah.
man, like the rounds of edits, it's funny. One of my artists' biggest pet peeves is like they'll send three designs, and like one will be like the one that they include because they want to include
Yeah.
a design, just like showing that like we're doing a lot of different thoughts, and they'll pick the client will pick like the least favorite one, and they're like, no, why did I
Okay.
include that?
That's the general rule. Never put anything in a pitch deck that's either as a joke or as, yeah, just put that in. It's not as good. They'll never pick it
Because
because
they
they'll
always
always
pick it.
go for either the joke entry. Yeah.
That is that makes me sad. So just a few more questions for you. One thing I'm really curious about is like obviously you're experimenting in a lot of different ways, and you're on books like Drifter and Zero and things like that.
Yeah.
You're you're approaching it in a lot of different ways. But what I guess if you had your druthers, what would you like to see more from comics in terms of design? Like what directions would you like to go
Oh
that you haven't went
God.
yet? Did I just
Oh,
open up
that's a
Pandora's
very
box?
loaded. What's that? Yeah, that's, oh man, this, I don't know. I think it would be, I think I'd love to see, like, the oil tankers turn more quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I I can see, and I think it's not necessarily just I don't think you should like put everything on the shoulders of the publishers. I also think I think it's a thing that has to come from both the publishers and the audience as well, the readership, to kind of try to embrace, like, newness
Yeah,
or like
innovation.
modernity. And I think, yeah, innovation, I think there's like there I th- and I might be completely wrong, but I think there's a nugget of truth there. um a lot of comic book readers will also be gamers, and you would see people like throw themselves over like the next, like when the new Metal Gear Solid game comes out, or there's like, Destiny, for example. Those games, what you see, like the innovation that's happening in games, in both tech, gameplay, design, packaging, advertising, that gets embraced. But then there's like that disconnect. Like someone might like really get into, like, what a game like Destiny does, but then they would be more hesitant to like go that same way with, with a comic that would do a certain thing, or a publisher that would do something in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think there's like that kind of disconnect between you know, different mediums
Hmm.
where things might be accepted in one type of industry, but it might look weird or not connect with an audience in a different industry. And I think there's a middle ground where you can kind of adapt techniques, adapt tactics, adapt certain design languages to make a product more successful.
Yeah. Well, and one thing I want to talk about, oil tanker related is, I love that we're referring to them as oil tankers now. Um, the
I'm gonna
having
start a new thing here.
We totally are. I love it. I'm totally into it. But having asked Jonathan Hickman a couple questions or some questions for this design article, he had
Yeah.
said that with his work, like for Marvel, which he definitely incorporates plenty of like design elements, and
Oh yeah,
he's got the
definitely.
transitions that he uses in his creator own books, like in like
Yeah.
Secret Wars, and anyways, and so he said that like he basically just asked Marvel if they were cool with it, and they're like, sure. And
Yeah.
so I'm curious as to like, and not saying that there's like that every creator should be like pushing Marvel and DC to let them incorporate like outside the box design into their work, but I am curious as to how much of the sameness that we see in some of the Marvel and DC work is related to like people not wanting to kind of push the envelope as far as those books look, like even the creators, not just like the people that work for the publisher.
Yeah. Well, I think that is I think there's a case to be made that you'll see some titles have like a specific look and feel, and you wouldn't touch that. I mean, I I I think if someone would come along and decide that the Superman logo needs to be completely different,
Oh God.
that it's not gelling. I mean, yeah, exactly. It's like what?
I would not go on
Impossible.
Twitter that day.
No, I think there's a case to be made that some things are, um, I wouldn't say untouchable, but there are things like, if they haven't changed the Coca-Cola logo because there's no need to change the Coca-Cola logo.
Right.
Um, and I think there's many instances in comics where you look where there's like there is like a brand image and kind of like a recognition that you wouldn't want to change because it doesn't need to be changed.
Sure.
And what would the reason be for the change,
Hmm.
um but at the same time there's like many, there should be room to play with those things. Tradition and invention should be able to occupy the same room because there's so many different, comics is such a rich medium and there's so much variety going on in kind of like what's being published, and I don't think it should all look the same.
I completely agree. Well, speaking of people, like people who are pushing comics in exciting ways, like what designers are like this is your chance to tout your fellow designers. What designers are doing work?
Never. I will never do such a thing.
They're the enemy. So what designers are doing work today that really impresses you? Like, and also, do you like pick up comics specifically because of impressive design? Is that something you do?
Oh, definitely, definitely. Screw the artists. Screw the writer. I'll go for a logo any day. Um, um, yeah, I think I mean we've already talked about those guys, but I think what Jarrett Fletcher is doing, what Stephen Finch is doing. I mean, I pick up the books of those guys just because of the logo or because I know they're designing something.
Hmm.
Similarly, Ryan Hughes he's been around for a long time, and he's like, if you look at his site, like the amount of work that he's been doing in comics that has been used, but also hasn't been used. I mean, there's like one set of, I think like a few years ago, Jared redesigned all the X-Men logos.
Hmm. I believe so.
And I think a little bit before that, a little bit before that, Ryan Hughes also did some X-Men redesigns. But then on his side, he has all the other designs that got bounced,
Hmm.
and there's like some really really good stuff in there. I think that would have been perfect for X-Men, but it's that same thing. Like, how far do you want to stray away from from the norm,
Hmm.
um, without alienating your readers.
Right.
So yeah, I'd say Jared, Stephen Finch, Ryan Hughes, Brian Wood as well. I mean, like his DMZ covers, and like when he was doing Planetary with Warren Ellis, those guys. I think even Jonathan. I think what he did when he broke into the industry with Nightly News and like the design. Really the design aspects that he used in his work, I thought was a genius move, because he came from design and advertising, and he kind of like took all the stuff that we were doing in design and kind of just went like, I'm just gonna smash this on a page and that's it. And people had never seen something like that before, and it kind of like it launched him into comics. So I still think that was incredibly clever of him to kind of like have that insight and kind of like wanting to take that risk, because at the same time people might have just gone like, what is this, this is not art, this is not comics.
Hmm. I do think that there is like I know that there are some people who are like turn up their nose to it and are just like, oh, this isn't how comics are supposed to look. But I do think that one of the things that I've been seeing increasingly is that there is a large portion of people who are really excited by some of the changes and like some of the looks that like people like Jonathan and yourself and Ryan and Jared bring to books, because like it's like something as simple as They're Not Like Us, like you're talking about, by putting the credits on the cover
Yeah,
and having the first panel on the cover and everything. Like that's something I'd never seen in that way before.
yeah,
It's a simple change, but it makes that book far more interesting in a very simple way.
yeah. But I mean, it's not that surprising that people get excited about it, because it's things, it's like bringing a certain aesthetic and a certain approach to comics that people would see outside of
Right.
comics anywhere else. So it kind of it's like, if you see cool stuff done in like, or like, how design is being used in films or in magazine publishing or in games,
Hmm.
and you kind of inject that into comics, of course it's gonna appeal to people, because there's a sense of, people recognize that kind of visual language, and
Hmm.
people are a lot savvier than you'd expect.
Hmm.
It's not about, like treating your audience as little kids. I mean, if you look at, like, people are online all the time, there's like so many different visual cultures going on. You just need to, like, look around and tap into certain things, bring them into comics, and that kind of like makes the medium a lot richer, and you kind of appeal in the same moment, you appeal to a segment of the audience.
Hmm. No, I completely agree, and I think what you're saying, like bringing in the like people, it's not like people who read comics exclusively engage with comics; they're engaging with everything every day, and so
Exactly.
yeah, seeing elements from like one thing that I remember becoming a thing several years ago was there was that one trailer for David Fincher's the girl with the dragon tattoo movie from the trailer, where like there was big font across the screen.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and like that just started showing up everywhere. And I don't remember what the comic was, but it showed up in some like comic in like an ad or something like that. And I just remember being like, oh my god, we're Finchering out like
Oh yeah.
comics now. And it was interesting to see like that kind of influence into the comic world. But I mean,
Yeah.
it really proves that influence can come from anywhere, and not even necessarily influence, but just like those design elements, like they can be incorporated in a lot of different ways that a lot of people don't foresee or expect. So, the last question I had for you, Tom, is this is completely random. It's mostly generated by the fact that my wife is she works in design and architecture, and I always find this really fascinating. She has a really hard time turning off her brain when it comes to like seeing things like involving buildings or like design and stuff. Like she's like, oh my god, and judging.
Oh yeah.
Is that something? Can you not turn off that part of your brain, or are you
Oh
just
yeah. No, I sympathize with your wife. I know exactly what that is.
yeah?
we'd go. I mean, I we'd go to say like go out. I'd go out with my wife, go for dinner or something, and
Hmm.
I would start criticizing the menu because of how it's typeset, or I would just spot and point at random things and go like, that's not right, that's not right, that looks weird. Oh, that's a nice color, hang on, I need to take a picture of this. Yeah, it's I mean, I don't mind it really, because it kind of like it's all fuel.
Hmm.
But yeah, I know, I do have a hard time switching off.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I do think it's funny. Like the only thing that I think really bothers my wife is in movies, glass breaks in a very unreal way, and she gets so mad at it whenever she's like, "That's not how glass breaks."
Yeah.
And it is just kind of funny how like those things just pop up. Like you're saying, like you're walking down the street and you're like, I gotta take a picture of this color. I haven't seen this color. It's a good
Yeah, yeah.
color. Uh, anyways, well, that's actually all I have for you, Tom. I thank you so much for coming on and talking design with me. I really appreciate you giving me some insight into your world.
Uh, you're welcome.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel from Sketch.com. You can find this week's guest, Tom Muller, on the web at hellomuller.com, on Twitter at HelloMuller, on Tumblr at hellomuller.tumblr.com, and in his work on books like Drifter and Wolf. You can find more Sketch content at Sketched, that's SKTCHD.com. Follow us on Twitter at SketchComic, and like us on Facebook at /Sketched. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.